We're going to return to the chapter with relationships, in particular as it relates to doing business with close friends, family members, etc. But now I want to transition to teams and multi-parties in negotiation. So we so far have been involved primarily in negotiations that involve two people or two parties. And those are fairly common, in fact, but there are also other kinds of negotiations that go beyond one-on-one. The multi-party negotiation is where there are three or more sides. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean three people. It could be three organizations that are coming together to bid on a project or on a major proposal, and there may be multiple people representing each organization. You have, in that case, kind of a combination team multi-party negotiation. But you'll see what this multi-party negotiation looks like when we do the exercise in class called going across the pond. Imagine in an easier way, first time you moved into your college dorm or apartment with several other roommates, and you tried to negotiate who's doing what chores, who's paying what bills. That's a pretty common early multi-party negotiation. Team-based negotiations may have two teams or more, and each side is working together within the team, but across these groups in order to try to identify these common interests, etc. And so we see this a lot in organizations in terms of vendor-supplier agreements where it's two organizations, but each organization is represented by multiple individuals. As you can imagine, while there are certainly some commonly held beliefs within the different individuals who work for the same organization, the big mistake that teams tend to make is assuming that we all work for the same company, so we must all feel the same way about the negotiation and the goals. And so we don't have those conversations, and we allow this negotiation to go forward. And there are not only differences of interests and opinions across the two parties, but actually within. So let's dig a little bit deeper and look at what some of those challenges might be. So having teams in negotiations can actually be a good thing. So before we talk about the challenges, what's good about teams in negotiations? Well, more people means more questions that are asked, more information that is exchanged, more ideas, right? The greater diversity there is among the people represented in terms of where they're coming from, their backgrounds, their functional areas of expertise, etc., the greater likelihood that there are diverse ideas and more of them that are generated. So the other thing that's a nice benefit of having a team is that where there might be a chance of conflict that others might not buy into, whatever it is this new negotiated path forward is, where there are more people involved on the team, then there's a greater chance of representation from the different departments that would increase the likelihood of buy-in across the different departments. So it's kind of like having some kind of an ad hoc group in the organization represented by different functional areas, and these people who come from these areas representing the interests of their departments are not only representing themselves but the departments, and so in theory these solutions would then represent more people and greater buy-in, not unlike, for example, the negotiations in Glasgow right now on climate change. Each country or major state is negotiating as a member of this larger negotiation with the thought that this person represents the interests of the country and comes back, and hopefully everybody is on board with their elected representative.
As if negotiation isn't challenging enough when it's one-on-one, not surprisingly, when the size of the group that is negotiating increases and or there are multiple members representing each team at a negotiating table, there are a number of key challenges that I will talk about in turn. This is a partial list, but one that I'll spend a few minutes talking through. So one of the obvious issues is we each want to be heard. We each want to make clear and persuasive arguments for our point of view, our positions, etc. Well, the more people that are involved, obviously, the more airtime that is being jockeyed for. And not only that, not only does it take quite a bit more time, and I think of it as more multiplicative than additive in terms of the number of people, it's because finding that agreement becomes that much more difficult. Two people finding overlapping interests is one thing, but you add a third, a fourth, a seventh, you can imagine how much more difficult it is to find those shared interests, those shared objectives. And so it takes more time. It becomes much more complicated to navigate these conversations. And of course, as in any work team, which is it not a similar kind of team here in this negotiation space, there will be disagreements that occur because of the various differences that we bring into the room, not just our gender and our cultural background and our generational differences, but also our values and the way we look at the world. We talk about functional diversity, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this becomes a real challenge. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it would be a great idea if one person, and that could rotate every, say, half hour, were responsible for facilitating the process. There would be some rules, of course, that would be agreed upon as to what they can and cannot facilitate and how objective they are to try to remain during the time that they are essentially watching the dynamics, paying close attention to not just what is said, but how it is said and how the baton is proverbially passed amongst the various speakers. So to focus on the process, to try to have less chaos and less problems, fewer problems associated with this competition for airtime. There are also preparation challenges. As you know, it takes a while to think through a deep preparation for your negotiation, what you want and why, and assumptions and all of that. When you have another member on your team, you cannot assume that you're on the same page. Quite the opposite. Even though you may work for the same company or even the same product line or division, it is highly likely that there are differences in what each person thinks and wants. And so taking the time to understand where the priorities are, what the trade-offs might be, and spending the time together working through one of these strategic outlines is really important. Moreover, it's important to, again, not assume, but speak openly about what is your plan for presenting yourselves as a team. Is it every man for themselves? Is it one person is kind of the lead negotiator and the others are kind of backup or subject matter experts, or, paying attention to the dynamics, but only speaking when they are sure that this is going to make a significant impact? Because again, you have the airtime challenges, but this is something else that you can think about ahead of time and prepare for how you're going to handle this much more complicated negotiation. Any kind of formal or informal rules of engagement that may be applied to a negotiation become even more needed to be clarified. So how is it that we are going to make decisions? Is it majority rule, which, by the way, if there are 8 people in the room and 5 wins, that means 3 people may be significantly unhappy. And so what exactly is the decision rule? And is everybody clear on what consensus is? I know from my experience in organizations and in the classroom that many people mistakenly believe that consensus is unanimity, that everyone agrees. So for example, if I were to say, hey, after our session, let's go to the nearest bar and I buy the first round. I mean, who would disagree with that? But consensus actually is not 100% agreement. It's hard to get there. And it also requires a lot of time and open-mindedness. And so consensus is actually a decision-making rule that says we will take the time to understand everyone's point of view and get to the point where we could support the agreement of the group, even if we don't entirely agree with it. So consensus means I understand why we're making the decision, where it's coming from, and I will support it. It may not be my first choice, but I will support it. And I'd like you to pause for a moment and check your own understanding of what consensus is. We may have a different understanding. And another example related to decision making, this also kind of speaks to, in the cross-cultural section, we talked about monochronic and polychronic time in negotiation. Well, in polychronic time, negotiators will talk about issues maybe at the start sequentially, but we may come back to a previously decided idea, an agreement that was decided, but we might come back to it. And for some, that might be, oh no, that's not possible. We've already decided that. So talking about how we decide and how final these decisions are is important. Other procedures that you might talk about is timeouts, dinner breaks, the use of technology. So understanding what those rules of engagement are and articulating them so that we're all on the same page is really critical. Another element to minimize the chaos is, as we've talked about, have some kind of an agenda. One group might come up with a straw man and the other might kind of add their 2 cents to it, and just have this basic idea of what we're talking about, what is and is not to be discussed, approximately how much time we might spend on it. And when we get to that guideline of time limit, what is again our procedure? Do we say that's it, it's 15 minutes, we're done? Or does somebody say, well, it looks like we have underestimated the amount of time we need to get through this decision. Shall we see where we are in 10 more minutes? Personally, I'm a fan of the latter. Of course, that could be overused and we could get into negotiations that take forever. But I remind you that Americans in particular are, compared to others around the world, very rushed. Time is money. Let's get this done. Let's get it over with. Let's sign these documents. And not everyone has that same feeling. I personally would say, if you don't have the time to do it right, when will you have the time to do it over? And connect that with issues of trust. And you could have some significant problems, again, trying to get through this more complex negotiation, particularly when you are lacking some clear guidelines for the procedures and process. So I mentioned a few times this idea of trust. And while you would all agree that issues of trust between teams exist, right? Oh, we think they're trying to take advantage of us, they're trying to sell us a bill of goods, or they're not offering us their best deal or their best delivery. There are also cases where within the team there are issues of trust. Again, another reason to have those conversations ahead of the negotiation together. What is our plan? What are our priorities? Can we come to agreement and alignment on how we present ourselves as a team, and not assume, and this is especially the case I find in family business, where if we all share the same last name, we must be on the same page. And I say that tongue in cheek because that is absolutely not true. So recognizing that the more people you add to the table, the more difficult it is to develop trust, and how negatively that could affect the negotiation and what we're willing to discuss, how open-minded we are to other solutions and other potential options for agreement. And so as a result, there tends to be much more of a move toward distributive bargaining, this claiming of value, as opposed to the more integrative creating value. So I leave you to consider, how can you in a multi-party negotiation start off by developing trust, by recognizing that this is even more of an issue than in a one-on-one negotiation. And there is some very recent research that suggests breaking bread together, having a meal together, goes a long way to developing trust among, in particular, people who really haven't gotten a chance to meet one another. So it's seeing them in a more informal light and getting to know them personally. And it's not just food, but when we get to know each other a bit more in a more fleshed out sort of way, we then have the opportunity to find these commonalities. So we might have similar hobbies, we might have come from different, the same schools, or we have similar favorite sports teams, for example. And it's those identifications of commonalities and similarities that help build trust. So again, something to think about. So you may have heard the term coalition before as it relates to negotiations, and they are often seen as negative. And the fact is, they can be positive as well. So the ones that you've heard of that are negative, they are negative because there are these kind of like backroom dealings where some people come to the negotiation, pretend to be open-minded, but have already kind of penned a deal behind closed doors. And so this, and I say pen a deal, I mean more informally. And so these coalitions are aiming to influence the negotiation because there's not one person who is considering, oh, do we do this or not, but rather 2 or 3 or 4 people who have already coalesced around an idea. And so it becomes much more difficult, and it's almost seen as blocking behavior, that this group has gone off and done this thing before this meeting, and they are standing together to block progress in this other direction. So that's probably how you thought of coalitions, but coalitions can also be helpful. And again, going back to this idea that the more people at the table, the more difficult it is to find that agreement and that consensus, and the more time that it takes. And as a result, and I've been in negotiations that have 20 people. As a result, it's often a good strategy to have subgroups around particular issues or elements of the negotiation go off and come back with a straw man proposal on that issue. And this is intended to save some time and be more efficient. So a group comes back to the table, each group comes back on these various elements, which, yes, that could potentially be problematic if these elements are related but are somehow decided upon in a mutually exclusive way. But the idea here being is having a sub-team agree and present to the rest of the group, well, here's what we're thinking about how we might implement this decision. It could move the group toward agreement in a positive way and more quickly than had these alliances or coalitions not formed. So we don't need to go into a lot of detail on cultural differences and the impact that they have on negotiations, as we talked about them in the previous module. But again, the more people, the more diversity, the more diversity, the more difficulty coming to these decisions. Further complicating this concept as it relates to negotiation is the idea that within different cultures, working as a team may come as more or less natural, more or less comfortable. So in cultures where there's a strong sense of individualism, it's very difficult for negotiators to find a collaborative solution because it's all about me, right? Here's what I want, here's what I think. That's really interesting, but let me tell you what I think, right? Whereas in more collectivistic cultures like Mexico, Japan, China, the idea of subordinating their own individual needs for the good of the group is common, it's natural. And so it is true that some prior research has shown that negotiators who do come from these collectivistic cultures, and it's a continuum, it's not just countries exist on one end of or the other of the spectrum, but the improvement, the higher quality outcomes come from negotiators who hail from more collectivistic cultures. That should not come as a surprise.
Because these kinds of group dynamics can, in fact, negatively impact both what's being said and how the group is communicating, making decisions, trying to move forward, a few of these items are worth mentioning. So, for example, having side conversations might seem fairly benign, but if those side conversations between members of the various groups become questioned, like, well, what are they talking about over there? And, what kind of cards are they showing and not showing, and so on and so forth, this can become potentially detrimental, a feeling of, again, reducing the trust, which is already likely to be challenged by this greater number of people at the table. We might look at silent members as a benefit in some ways, right? Because this increased use of airtime, now we have fewer people who are talking. Isn't that a good thing? Well, yes, as long as their silence is not a sign that they are unwilling or unable to speak up and disagree, perhaps because somebody more senior is in the room. So silence should not be assumed to mean acceptance, and it would be a really good idea if, especially in your group of 2 or 3 or more, you appoint somebody to not necessarily disconnect from the negotiation completely, but to focus primarily on the group dynamics, on kind of being a bit of a process consultant or facilitator. So somebody could act as a gatekeeper and say, hey, Janie, I noticed that when Bob said X, you winced a little bit. What's going on? Is this something that you think is going to be hard to implement? Say more. So noticing these kinds of dysfunctional or potentially dysfunctional individual and group behaviors among the team is worth bringing up, and doing so in such a way that perhaps brings the issue onto the table for people to talk about, because to allow these kinds of dynamics to go on unchecked could potentially upend the entire negotiation. So think about how people are interacting, when they're interacting, and whether they're blocking the kinds of conversations. Because, for example, groupthink, as I'm sure you know, is this idea of, wow, we've been having dinners together and we're making really good progress in these series of merger and acquisition meetings, and it's so nice and so harmonious. So I'm not going to say anything that would suggest disagreement because I don't want to rock the boat. And well, yeah, nice in the short term, perhaps, but in the long term, this could threaten the likelihood of the agreement being kept and sustained over time. So watch out for some of these dynamics and see if there's a way to address them as they occur. So it's not necessarily a given that, oh, we're going to have this big negotiation between our So you've already had the practice of spending time fleshing out your outlines to ensure that you are ready for the negotiation, what you want and why you want it, what the other person probably wants. How can I establish credibility early on? What questions could I ask to find those underlying interests? All of those components are important in any negotiation, even more so with a team. So having a conversation, it's almost as if you, along with the team, were to discuss and complete such an outline. And you can see why that is. Your goals, as I said earlier, may or may not be aligned. And if here you are, 2 or 3 people representing the same company, and even you don't agree on what the goals are, what you must get versus, what you're willing to accept, you can see how this could be really, really difficult. What the role of each member is going to be, as I mentioned, one person might be the lead negotiator, another one might be kind of a timekeeper, and still another might be someone who focuses their energy on the process and how dysfunctional it may become. And so having a conversation ahead of time as to who's doing what, especially in a team negotiation, is a good idea. This way we know not only if we're on the same page, but when certain phases of the negotiation occur, it may even be the case that one person plays lead in the kind of information sharing phase, where then another person plays lead when it comes to the actual declaring what is and isn't in this negotiation or agreement going forward. So taking the time to be clear on what we want and why we want it as a team is essential. Once you are assembled at the negotiation and you've got these multiple individuals representing the different organizations or constituencies, it's a really good idea to agree upon and use an agenda. And this is something that could be done actually in advance of the negotiation. One party might put together a draft and say, here's what I think we might use. What do you think? Is this okay? Would you like to modify it, etc.? And again, that's a great way to start the negotiation. Hey, here's our agenda we agreed upon. last Friday, let's kind of get down to it. It should not be assumed that everybody knows everybody else, so introducing everyone and clarifying rules. And the rules, I don't mean they're so much this person's here and they're the timekeeper and this person is here, right? But rather, if there is a person who is the lead negotiator, and we're doing this for the sake of the best use of time, clarify that. Clarify that these other people also might be here because of their subject matter expertise, or that Jonathan was part of the team that negotiated a previous contract that was similar to this. So it's a good idea to kind of clarify those things. Before the negotiation actually begins, what is and isn't okay? Are phones and laptops allowed? Are interruptions allowed? Are we going to be recording this or not? Are we going to take a break? And if so, at what time? And who's going where, etc. So, have some understanding on what that is so that it's less likely to become a conflict later on. It's also, as in any meeting, a great idea to have some kind of note-taking that's occurring not just at your seat and at your desk, but also on a flip chart or a whiteboard, having everyone able to look and see where we are relative to the agenda, the decisions that are made so far, what are some options for deciding other pathways going forward. It can be a very helpful way of keeping track of not only where we are, but what we've said and what we've agreed on in the past. To not do that and just to have one person take notes at their desk is really a lost opportunity for that kind of consensus building. Obviously, as in any negotiation, active listening skills, summarizing skills are really important. And I've mentioned the use of facilitation or process consultation skill and use. Now, mediators, from a strict sense of the term mediator, may or may not be needed or desirable, at least at the first attempt at becoming, deciding together what this set of parties is going to decide. But if it is suspected that there's going to be a lot of conflict, it might not be a terrible idea to have somebody who is trained in mediation, who is willing, should it be necessary, to work with the parties by having them at some point caucus, go into separate rooms, and kind of having this one person try to help each group find the underlying interests, resolve some of the conflicts that are occurring. Because it becomes unwieldy at times with 6 or 7 people at the table with multiple issues, it's not a bad idea to kind of look for the low-hanging fruit at first. Even if it's something as simple as, hey, let's agree that at 12:30, no matter where we are, we're going to stop and we're going to go grab lunch. It may sound silly, but that kind of group memory where we've agreed on something is a way to come back and say, okay, we may be struggling to work out this agreement, but at least we do agree that we're going to have lunch at 12:30. I mentioned earlier the idea of an alliance or a subgroup as a way of securing a tentative agreement. Again, sending a few people off on a difficult topic to come back with a straw man is a really good way to move consensus along in a multi-party or team-based negotiation. And where it's important, or where it seems like the more we talk about it, the more we can't agree, those timeouts or caucuses are really helpful to use. And it's not a sign of weakness, it's rather a sign of desiring greater productivity and efficiency, and wanting to maintain the relationship. So having a breather, a cooling off period, whether it's an hour or a day or a week, is not a bad idea. And then finally, just because we've agreed on certain things, it's not a good idea to just end the meeting and say, okay, great, we're done. Let's, have our admins type up the notes, but rather take a few moments to sum up. All right, well, on issue A, here's where we stand. On issue B, we've agreed on this, but we still have an open item with regard to this issue. So taking the time to publicly, everyone, talk about what we did and didn't agree to and what next steps, if any, there may be in the presence of everyone is a really good idea to reduce conflict later on, as opposed to just getting a set of minutes written up after the fact. So these guidelines can be extremely helpful to improve not just the outcomes, but especially the process during these multi-party or team-based negotiations.